So like Sherry said, I'm Corinne Williams. I'm an underwriter with Plico. My voice does carry, but not as well as Sherry, so I'm going to use the mic. All right, so I'm going to help you guys walk through when you look at insurance coverages, what some of your options are and what some of those different options mean. So we're going to look at policy types, limits, what consent to settle means, and then selecting a carrier. So there's two main types of medical professional liability. We have occurrence policies and we have claims-made policies. Some companies offer both. So Plico and MedPro both offer both of these types, but there are many companies that will only offer you claims-made coverage. So occurrence coverage means that you are covered if the incident occurs, hence occurrence, when the policy is in place. So if the policy is in place when the treatment or the incident occurs, you have coverage under your occurrence policy. With claims made, you're covered if the policy is in place when the claim itself is made. So not when the incident occurred, but when the claim is made. If your policy is in force, then you have coverage. So let's look at an example. So we have two incidents that are occurring. We have one thing happens in 2021, one thing happens in 2022. And then each of those ends up becoming a claim, both of which are filed in 2023. So let's look at how these two policies would cover this. So for an occurrence policy, because the incident occurred when your 2021 policy was in place, you would have coverage under that 2021 policy. When the 2022 incident occurred, your 2022 occurrence policy is going to cover that claim, because it was in force when that incident occurred, because this is occurrence coverage. So even though these items were filed after the fact in 2023, you're still going to have coverage because the policy was in place when it occurred, okay? And one thing to think about here is this is two different sets of limits, which we'll get into that more when there's limits, but here you've got two different policies covering these. Okay, this is what the claims made one's going to look like. So the incident occurs. This policy has been in force for 3 years, just like the occurrence policy. So an incident occurs in 21, incident occurs in 22. Both are filed in 2023. Because the policy is in force in 2023, both of these claims are going to be covered. But if you notice, they're both going to be under that 2023 policy because it's triggering coverage when the claims are filed, not when the incident occurred. Okay? Any questions on that so far? I know that's like a lot of jargon. No? All right. We're going to look at it a little bit different way. So this is pretty much the same thing, but we're just going to put it up there differently because I know, everybody learns a little differently. So let's say that you get sued during the policy period for something that happened during the policy period. If you have occurrence coverage, your policy is going to protect you for that. Now let's say you get sued after the policy period. So this is the example that we had on those previous two slides. You're sued after the policy period for something that happened, something that occurred during the policy period. You're still going to have coverage for that if you have occurrence coverage. All right, now let's look at claims made. So if you get sued during the policy period for something that happened during the policy period, you're good on claims made because the claim was made while the policy was in effect. But let's say that you get sued after the policy period for something that occurred during the policy period. In this case, there's not going to be coverage because the claim was filed, the claim was made after the end of the policy period. Now, we do offer something that is going to help cover this gap because if you have a claims made policy and it cancels, everything that happened during that policy is no longer covered unless you purchase tail coverage. So you're going to probably hear this a lot throughout your career. Tail coverage is basically an additional add-on to your policy that covers that time period that the policy was in place. It's not needed on an occurrence policy because as long as it was in force when it occurred, no matter when that claim is filed, it can be filed 20 years down the road. If you're a pediatrician and you treated someone when they were young, and that statute of limitations doesn't start and you get a claim filed 20 years down the road with occurrence coverage, it does not matter. It's still going to be covered. But with claims made, you would need to purchase tail coverage to cover you for that time period that the policy was in place. Sometimes you'll hear it called an extended reporting endorsement. Basically, all that means is that it's adding an extended reporting period onto the end of your policy. So here we can see how this changes this scenario with the claims made coverage. So if you did not purchase tail coverage, then if you get sued after the policy period, there's no coverage. If you purchase tail, you've got that extended reporting period, meaning you have an extended time for claims to come in, and the policy is going to cover. Any questions so far on any of that? Yes. Tail is generally going to be indefinite. So the only tail policy that Plico and MedPro sell is an indefinite tail policy. So it's going to cover you forever. There are carriers, I will tell you, that offer like a 2-year tail or a 3-year tail. So that is something that occasionally is out there. We don't feel that that's enough coverage, and so we only sell the indefinite. Yes. So it's a one-time payment at the beginning of the term, which I think may actually be our next slide. So it is due at the time that the policy cancels, generally within 30 to 60 days. Yes. Yes, so every time you have a claims made policy and you cancel that policy, so let's say you work somewhere for 4 years, cancel that policy, then you go somewhere else. Every time you have a claims made policy, you would need a new tail policy for that term. Any other questions? All right, let's keep going. Okay, so here's your question about tail cost. So tail can be very expensive because essentially you're buying coverage for everything that happened while that policy was in place. So it can be up to 2 to 3 times your annual premium. It is typically due 30 to 60 days within at the end of your policy. Plico is 30 days. There are other carriers that are 60 days. This is something I'm sure Corey probably mentioned this to y'all earlier, but when you are looking at contracts, this is extremely important because you can negotiate sometimes to have this covered for you if you were to leave the practice. So let's say you go and you work for a group and you decide that you want to move on from that group after 6 years. If you don't have in your contract that they're going to pay for your tail, this could potentially be on you to pay 2 to 3 times your annual premium at the time that you leave. So you want to start thinking about that at the beginning of your contract negotiation, not when you're ready to leave and move on to somewhere else. There are also, a lot of times with hospital employment, they will build in the tail to the coverage, and so you won't necessarily be responsible for it, but you want to make sure that you understand how this is going to work preemptively. Okay, so here's a little bit of a scenario that could happen. So let's say that we have a doctor who's been practicing for 15 years. The office manager was the one that handled the MPL. So the office manager is paying the bills, the doctor's practicing medicine. Doctor's not worrying about this. Okay, so the office moves and the bills stop getting paid and that policy ends up canceled. And the office manager makes the decision down here that they're not going to buy the tail coverage. If this were to happen, all of those things that happened while that policy was in effect, there's not going to be coverage for. And I'll tell you, once you miss the due date on a tail, you're not getting it. It's a pretty strict industry-wide rule that those tail due dates are pretty set in stone. So pay close attention if there's ever an office move, you move employment, et cetera. You really want to make sure that if you have claims made coverage, you're paying attention to this tail. Okay. All right. So with occurrence, there's not a need for tail coverage, but there's a additional cost generally to occurrence on an annual basis. So your occurrence coverage generally is going to be a little bit more expensive than your claims made coverage, but it can save you money in the long run when you're not ending up having to pay for tail coverage. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not offered by all insurers. Okay. All right, so policy limits. So this is the most that your insurance company is going to pay in the event of a claim or an incident. You may have seen limits before on other policy types. Obviously, your health insurance generally has like a maximum that they'll ever pay for you. So same thing here. Each policy is going to have a limit of what it will pay for in that policy term. Our most common limit right now in Oklahoma is $1 million, $3 million. It's $1 million per occurrence, $3 million per aggregate for the policy period. We do sometimes see physicians carry more limits than that. It just depends on what their contract status is. With most of the health insurers require at least a $1 million, $3 million to be contracted with them. So that's definitely by far our most common limit. Okay, so here's where we get into why occurrence is slightly more expensive. Part of it is the tail coverage not being there, and as an insurance company, generally the claims are going to cost the same, whether they're an occurrence or claims made. So we're needing to collect a little bit of extra premium each year versus collecting it at the end. But here's the real reason why it's slightly more expensive. With occurrence coverage, if you have 35 years of occurrence coverage, every single year you're adding a limit. So each year, only the things that occurred in that year would be covered under that policy. And then the next year, you're getting a whole new limit for everything that occurs in that year. But with claims made, if you have a claims made policy for 35 years, you only have the limit of your active policy year. So if you've had that for forever, all those incidents that could have occurred over those 35 years are all going to fall in the most current year because it's the coverage of the year the claim is made, not when it actually occurs. Does that make sense? It's a little tricky. Okay. That's all right. It's tricky. So yes. Yes. Correct. Yes. So you could, say you had something filed in 2024 with a claims made policy, and then you had something else filed in 2027, you would have a limit for each of those. But if you had something happen in 2024 and something happen in 2027, and they both got filed in 2027, only the 2027 policy is going to take effect. Whereas with occurrence, you're going to have the 2024 policy trigger for the first thing and the 2027 policy trigger for the second thing. So you've got additional limits available. Yes. Mm-hmm. No. So it renews each year based on when those claims are made. But if you have multiple claims in the same year, even if with a claims made policy, so if you have multiple claims made in the same year, you only have that one limit, even if those things occurred in separate years. But with an occurrence policy, you've got multiple limits because those are spread out throughout the years in which they occurred. But you do have a new limit every year. So if you had a claim filed this year and a claim filed next year and a claim filed the next year, you would have limits for each of those. Yes. Yes. So there are statute of limitations, vary by state, vary by what the incident was. It's kind of a complicated, I am definitely not the expert on what all the statute of limitations are. But yes, there are some statute of limitations on when a claim can be filed. And that, again, varies very much by state, by specialty. Like pediatrics is a good example because a lot of times you have age majority concerns there as well. However, obviously, we don't recommend that you rely on that as this is never going to get filed because there's statute of limitations. That is up to, legal interpretation and up to the legal system to decide whether they're going to allow that. So yes, it does exist. And obviously, over time, the further you get away from an incident, the less likely it's going to be filed past a certain point. But, yeah. Did I see another hand? Okay. All right. Thank y'all.